TopMedTalk.
Welcome to part 2 of TopMedTalk's retrospective on Anesthesiology 2023, the annual general meeting of the American Society of Anesthesiologists. Part 1 is of course available. You need to check out the show notes to this podcast to find that. Also, you'll find links to all of the conversations in full that we reference in this piece. And we're going to begin with Elijah McMillan and Majesty Greer, MD candidates at Howard University College of Medicine. They're speaking about the importance of representation in education. They go to Howard University, a historically black college.
Let's talk a little bit about the terminology historically black university or college of medicine, because that, I think, for many people maybe around the world don't understand what that means. So Eli, do you want to tell us a little bit more about?
So it's on par with every other university around the country. It's just universities or institutions that were created to create a space that had equal opportunity for individuals of color and minorities. When we talk about HBCUs or historically black medical colleges, it doesn't exclusively mean that the whole student population is just black students.
Yeah.
There's definitely a huge diversity there as well, but it's an amazing creation that was made to create equal opportunities for individuals to gain access into the educational field as well to help further themselves.
Yeah. And Majesty, what attracted you to Howard? Was that one of the things that brought you to the university there, or?
Yes. Going into medicine, not having anybody in my family who's even gotten a bachelor's degree, I definitely wanted to go someplace that I felt like I would be included in people that looked like me or came from similar backgrounds as me. And so when I had an interview over at Howard, I really felt like the faculty and the staff had come from similar backgrounds, like I said, just similar experiences as me, and then talking to the medical students. And I do feel like with me going there, I really have made some lifelong friends because of that. And I really do feel like I found my community, and that was very important because I needed that support going into medical school, especially because I'm doing medical school in the mainland, far away from my family, so I have to find another support system.
And then as a woman, I can attest to this. It feels good. You feel supported whenever the people who are in leadership represent you and who you are and where you come from. To me, it's hard sometimes to really engage and interact with people who may not understand where I'm coming from.
And the link to the fuller conversation is, of course, available in the show notes to this piece. Now, the GAP study looks at gabapentin and perioperative pain. Results and analysis are available in this piece that we're now going to listen to a clip of. Ben Gibbison, consultant anaesthetist at University Hospitals Bristol NHS Foundation Trust, in conversation with Desiree Chappell, Mike Grocott and Guy Ludbrook.
It was major surgery, 3 body cavity surgeries, so cardiac, thoracic and abdominal surgery.
Oh, okay.
Took place in 7 NHS centres in the UK, placebo-controlled. It was originally powered, we were going to have 1,500 patients, 500 in each of those groups. It was powered to detect a difference of 12.5% in the length of stay in any one of those groups. And because of COVID and funding and things, actually, the National Institute of Health Research, we needed a little extension to complete it. And the deal was that we basically dropped the power to 80% power. We ended up, so 1,196 people randomised. Yeah. Half of them got gabapentin, half of them got placebo. And we measured it was powered for length of stay. So actually, as a sort of composite of pain control, post-operative pulmonary complications, all of that. So that's what what the power was about, rather than sort of pain control, specific numerical rating score of pain or reduction of opiates, which we knew from the meta-analyses we'd done for it.
And I mean, this has been a big question, there was some literature that came out last year, really kind of not debunking, I guess that's the wrong word, but kind of questioning the use of gabapentin and how useful it really is, right?
Yeah, so that was what was interesting. It was really the sort of, our study in fact showed what all the meta-analyses showed, which is that although it has statistical improvements in sort of pain control, i.e. it moved the numerical rating score from 4 to 3 or something like that, or it moved the amount of opiates in sort of a 24-hour period. It changed them from 30 milligrams on the first day to 25 milligrams. Yeah. And it actually didn't affect the amount of time that patients stayed in hospital it didn't affect anything else. It didn't affect their quality of life. Actually, the sort of long-term pain was worse in the gabapentin group, which sort of goes against the other stuff. And we followed these patients up. They got followed up daily in hospital, obviously, for safety and things like that. And then we followed them up at 4 weeks and 4 months afterwards.
Oh, wow. So you didn't see a difference?
We saw no difference in length of stay between either of those groups and in any group.
So the message for the practicing clinician, what do you take from that guy?
Yes. Well, I mean, in my world, gabapentin was the universal panacea.
Yeah.
And often more for persistent pain. It's clean, it's great, it's not an opioid, so you can prescribe it, happy birthday. And then, of course, it didn't quite work out that way. And it's, really not necessarily that good for your head, depending on your dose. And that became a bit of a problem. And then some of the efficacy data, certainly persistent pain, weren't as strong as it might be or weren't as consistent as it might be. So I'm kind of interested in terms of people's functioning on the trial. Did you look at that in terms of whether it did mess with your head, so to speak?
Yeah.
So in that we measured adverse events and serious adverse events, there was no difference between the two groups. One of the sort of limitations of the trial is that we had a relatively fixed dose, we had a very fixed dose of gabapentin. So patients got basically 600 milligrams of gabapentin as they were walking to the operating theatre or in the operating, in the anaesthetic room, and then 300 milligrams twice a day for 2 days afterwards. So it was a relatively fixed high dose. And that dose was based on a sort of dose-finding meta-analysis. And we think it was about right because about half the centres went, my God, that's too high. And the other half went, yeah, it'll never work. It's way too low.
It's too
usually
low
lower than that. So we thought we were in the ballpark. But what it meant is that, we don't know whether the people, whether clinical teams didn't randomise older people into the study because of that. So our sort of mean age was about 68, 69 for both groups. So we don't know the outcomes of sort of the older patient.
The more vulnerable.
Yeah.
One of the themes we noticed in our coverage of the conference was AI, artificial intelligence. It's the hot topic at the moment. We covered some of it in part 1, but here we get a sense of the discussion with a clip from Artificial Intelligence in Your Practice. Here, Ronald G. Pearl, ASA Committee on Innovation, Professor and Chair of the Department of Anesthesiology, Perioperative and Pain Medicine at Stanford University School of Medicine, explains.
Yes, so when we talk about AI, I think it's important to realize that we're not talking about a single technology. Artificial intelligence has been part of much of our technology now for decades. Every time we're using processed EEG in the operating room, that is a AI-driven technology. We have AI for very specific purposes, and then what we're often talking about is much more expanded AI. The generative AI, like you see in ChatGPT, is very, very different than much of the AI systems that we're talking about, which are much more sort of statistical, trying to predict, diagnose, categorize factors. And often people think about AI as being human-level general intelligence. We are so far away from that right now that that is pure hype at this point in time. But as we think about this large spectrum of AI, we need to be fairly specific about which things, and so some of them are accepted, some we may never see, some may be 5-10 years away.
For more on artificial intelligence, do check out that podcast, well worth a listen. Time now to return to a subject that has provided a bit of a theme here on TopMedTalk: intraoperative hypotension, IOH. AI, of course, dovetails into this subject nicely. Desiree Chappell discusses a recent study into IOH with Adam Spiegel, CEO of NorthStar Anesthesia, and Josh Lumley, Chief Quality Officer of NorthStar Anesthesia.
The research arm and really expanding in that. As private practices, we've done a little bit. We talked here on TopMedTalk last year. We partnered with USAP and Rick Dutton and published a study on the incidence of IOH in community-based practice, which I think is huge. I mean, to be able to do that, not a lot of private practices can participate in that. So that is a big opportunity.
Or are frankly, at this point in the game, willing to share their performance and going with a glass half full analogy, the opportunities for improvement.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And I think there's something that's really said to, a lot of our challenges in U.S. healthcare is around rural medicine.
Yeah.
So getting outside of the big academic downtown medical centers. And the problem with research is all the research is done in the big, sort of downtown medical centers. So unless the groups like us, USAP, are sharing some of that data and participating in the research, there's always going to be this void of, we have a lot of information about, what happens in Cleveland and in Baltimore, but it is very hard to figure out what's happening in sort of the rural areas where we're seeing some real challenges from a quality perspective. So I think that's an additional thing that we can bring to the table that without this kind of participation is going to be very hard to actually play out.
Yeah.
There's more on that in the show notes. Patient safety is always a theme here on TopMedTalk, and Elizabeth Ribello, Executive Director of Anesthesiology, Critical Care and Pain Medicine at the Cancer Network, and Professor, Department of Anesthesiology and Perioperative Medicine at MD Anderson Cancer Center. She has this to say on the subject of patient safety.
So having your pharmacy background and the work that you've already done, I know you're very passionate about medication safety, and that's something we talked a little bit on TopMedTalk about, but I would love to hear more, from your perspective, what we as Team Anesthesia need to be concerned about. I mean, I know I'm also Vice President of Clinical Quality for NorthStar Anesthesia, and we put out some recent kind of guidance for our teams around, mislabeling or, making sure you have the right medication that you're pulling out of the drawer and all those things. Right. I'm double checking. But from your perspective, what would you say are the top, things that we need to be concerned about?
So it's a hugely broad topic, and anyone that's practiced has either had or medication error, and there's some that continue to occur. And so, for example, insulin overdoses, and so having 1,000 units in a vial where there are trainees, and such is a recipe for error. And so having, that's one area where that insulin could be drawn, in the pharmacy and then brought to the OR for safety's sake. Phenylephrine in a vial. It's 100 times the dose. 10% of all medication errors perioperatively are due to phenylephrine overdose. Right? And so one of the ways to mitigate that is the pre-filled syringes. And just for so many different reasons, when you think about the medication administration process, right, it's prescription, preparation, dispensing, administration. And as anesthesiologists, we're in a unique position where we're actually doing all those 4 steps at one time. So having a pre-filled syringe eliminates that whole preparation process. Yeah. And so the argument, of course, is that, well, these are expensive. But when you think of a patient when you think about a medication error and the cost of a medication error itself, it really mitigates that cost. And it's really safest for our patients and also safest for our providers. Because one thing I don't talk about is when a medication error occurs, there's that whole second victim syndrome as well. And so it's beyond, it's a multifactorial issue. And so something easy to think about in terms of how can we make it more simple in terms of how can we prevent the human error aspect of it? How can we provide constraints that prevent us from, causing a medication error?
On the subject of patient safety, the Anesthesia Patient Safety Foundation is, of course, an organisation that TopMedTalk has sent you to look at in the past. Here we speak about intraoperative hypertension and hemodynamic stability, with a focus on improving patient safety in anaesthesia care. Michael Scott, Professor of Anesthesiology at the University of Pennsylvania, tells us more.
Yeah, I've only recently come into APSF, and what's I've been impressed with Dan Cole as president, but if you look at all the past presidents as well, is how engaging this society is and how effective it is at change management. It's really is going back to the days like with Mike Ramsey and things like that, that so that's been very powerful because they've got all these existing relationships like with the American College of Surgeons and all the perioperative nursing groups. And this is the key, is we've got to get everyone in on this. Yeah. We've got to educate people of what the problem is, the fact it's better to predict rather than be reactive, avoid the downstream harm. And then if we also then get everyone on board, then we will change the quality, but also we can start mapping the science a bit more.
Yeah.
If we can collect them. And obviously we're in a new age of live waveforms, AI, analytics. So we're hoping that might really lead to a brighter future. Because one of the things why Dan and I did the conference is we've been talking about this a long time now, haven't we? And we've had all these big papers that come out which shown we've just still got the same incidence of hypotension. Rick Dunn just published in general anesthesia practice at
Rick and
29% with your group. 29%, intraoperative hypotension, with the definition being longer than 15 minutes of less than 65. That's total. That isn't always consecutive minutes. But so we're suddenly realizing that we're not doing a great job as team anesthesia, and it's not because none of us want to do that. It's because it's a difficult topic.
Yeah.
And then you've got these different physiological situations. There's no doubt that a lot more hypotension happens under ventilation.
Yes.
And so we've got all these stressed volume. You've got left-right ventricular uncoupling.
Yeah.
Intrathoracic pressures, all these things that really haven't been worked through properly yet. But I think we've now at the stage we probably could.
Yeah.
Because we can collect the continuous data on patients. And then you've got going into the post-op, where often it's just a question that people are just getting fluid shifts and we're not just keeping the tank full enough.
Yeah.
We found certainly in the UK that if you just keep the tank full in the post-operative period with low-dose vasopressors, you could fix it very nicely.
Yeah. Yeah.
The Anesthesia Patient Safety Foundation can be found at apsf.org, and we'll get into more conversation about that in that podcast. Well worth a listen. The European Society of Anesthesiology and Intensive Care has been on TopMedTalks' radar this year. We heard from their president-elect, Wolfgang Burr, Professor and Chair, the Department of Anesthesiology, Division of Vital Functions, University Medical Centre in the Netherlands. Here he is in conversation with Desiree and Monty.
1st of January, I will be at the beauty to be the president of the European Society.
Yeah, congratulations.
My pleasure, thank
you. Why don't you tell us a little bit more about the organization as a whole, because I think they've gone through some transition in the last several years.
For sure. I think basically in the meantime, the ESAC has developed to an organization with 5 primary interests. The first and foremost is education. The second is scientific communication, including this wonderful congress we had in Glasgow, including all the programs we developed throughout COVID, like the webinars, the podcasts, etc. The third one is the examination, which is quite unique because the ESAC examination in anesthesia and intensive care is one well-respected examination throughout the world. Then we have the advocacy. So we try to be the voice of all European anesthesiologists. I think these areas are the core of the society. And together with Monty, with Thomas and a couple of others, we are relatively long active in running research to figure out what are the challenges in research and perioperative medicine throughout Europe. Mm-hmm. And this network has resulted in a couple of valuable publications, a couple of valuable research groups, and that's something we are definitely proud of.
Lots of collaboration.
Very collaborative.
Yeah.
It's one of the keys with the European side. Not that there aren't other societies that are very collaborative, but extremely successful on that front.
We also had an important conversation this time round about frailty with BobbieJean Sweitzer. She's the Systems Director of Preoperative Medicine at Inova Health, Falls Church, Virginia, and also Professor of Medical Education at the University of Virginia, the author and editor of Preoperative Assessment and Management, which is currently in its 3rd edition. The subject of frailty is important to us here on TopMedTalk, and these words emphasise that.
And you may say, but it's that Hawthorne effect, right? It's that labeling. We label patients with allergy bands. Okay, we still have to look in their medical record to see what they're allergic to, but we say, that big red band that says they're allergic to something. We label them as a fall risk.
Yeah.
And we know that these basic, simple things like that have made a difference. Putting something up on the patient's room that says they're hard of hearing or they cannot see well or whatever, right? So I think just start by having an assessment. And, if you have an electronic record, it's generally already available to you. assessment tool that can pull information from your electronic record, labeling patients as frail, start to educate people that frail patients need cared for differently, educating the patient and the family. Is this patient capable of going home and taking care of themselves? A lot of people now don't live close to their family members. They don't have family members to take care of them. We tell people they all have to have a ride home, but then we drop the ball. We just get them home.
Yeah.
We don't tell them what else to do. So I think, basic things. If you don't have access to a frailty assessment tool, there's 2 quick and easy ways to sort of identify a group of frail patients. Any patient who's had 3 or more falls in the 6 months prior to surgery have a 100% risk of a complication in the perioperative period. Of course, falling is a marker of frailty and not doing well. Activities of daily living. There's a very good study out of the VA that looked at activities of daily living, those who were fully functional, those who were either fully dependent on someone else or even just partially dependent on someone else to take care of themselves, bathing, feeding, dressing themselves. These were community-dwelling people, not SNF patients.
Yeah.
And they showed that those who were even just partially dependent on someone else had higher risk. It was like moving them, and they looked at the ASA physical status scoring, and it moved them into the higher ASA physical status score. So a 2 independent person was, that 2 who was partially dependent was like a 3 independent person. So, I think just looking at some really basic assessments and then making sure that, you hopefully have some geriatricians and primary care doctors who can help facilitate in those transitions of care back. And then trying to engage your patients in shared decision-making about their goals of care, and your surgeons about really engaging these patients about goals of care, because many of them, it's not about how long they live. It's whether they can continue to live independently, or they continue to drive if they're driving, if they're going to make it to their, great granddaughter's graduation.
Yeah, and that's what's important too.
Yeah, and so many of them don't understand. We really don't spend time telling them how long it's going to take them to recover from this total joint. So even sometimes the timing of surgery is not ideal.
Yeah,
because they think they're going to be in 2 weeks and back. So, I could go on and on, but I think that, depends on where you're at. But a lot of geriatricians are very interested in helping us in this space. So try to find a geriatrician, try to find a champion surgeon who's, willing to work with you. And you can start small. Again, identifying patients, getting your nutritionists involved in these patients, just simply giving a patient like 3 weeks of Ensure pre-op who's nutritionally deficient has been shown to lower risk and complications. And some of these older patients live alone and they don't eat so well, right?
Yeah.
They don't taste as well. They don't have good teeth. They don't like to cook for themselves.
Yeah.
And, I'm guilty of that.
I know. I do. And it's the same, but, too, as someone who's, giving the medications, doing monitoring, all these things, we have to make sure we're not, over medicating or giving medications that actually cause issues, right? Or monitoring their brain.
I do have a moment to say something else, and thank you. And I think you asked me this at the very beginning, and then you came back, especially speaking to the intra-op. I think this idea that, it's okay to give everybody a general anesthetic, or that we give sedation that is really a general anesthetic, but we call it sedation.
Yeah.
Thanks for downloading TopMedTalk. Don't forget, of course, you can subscribe, and don't forget to check out some of the links in these podcasts that will send you back to some of the conversations that we had during our coverage of Anesthesiology 2023. It's not a full list. We did more podcasts than we had time to cover in these programs, so make sure you check them all out, and they're clearly divided with the hashtag ANES23.
TopMedTalk.
Thanks for downloading TopMedTalk. Don't forget to subscribe via your podcatcher. Don't forget to check us out on social media. We're on Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, and YouTube. And also, don't forget, TopMedTalk is the broadcasting arm of EBPOM, Evidence-Based Perioperative Medicine. We'd love you to find out more about that. If you check out ebpom.org, you can find low prices on some of the conferences we're organising around the world. Many of them are virtual and don't even involve you leaving your own home. Check out ebpom.org now.